Welcome to part 2 of the 21st Century Literacy Multimodality and Multi-Genre video workshop. We've already talked about how we might define literacy in the 21st century and how multimodality might fit into that definition. Now, what about multi-genre composition? What is that? How is it similar? How is it different? Again, please follow along with the PowerPoint in this video, and please pause and work through any activities when asked. Similar to multimodality, multi-genre broken down in the word itself gives us multiple and genre, combining different styles of communication. The text, again, is still a piece of communication as a whole, so all the genres combined can give us one text. A genre is a category of style that typically has common form, content, or techniques, typically all falling in the linguistic mode. Here are some examples. Journal entries, a greeting card, a monologue representing internal conflicts, classified or personal ads. Top 10 list, glossary or dictionary, song lyrics. If you'd like to look at more, follow this link at the bottom of the PowerPoint. And from Colorado State, you'll see a ton of more ideas and examples of genres, different genres. Why might we consider multi-genre? What's the importance here? Tom Romano, who is an author, writer, teacher that we attribute ideas of multi-genre to, and his quintessential text, Blending Genre, Altering Style, says the following. A multi-genre paper arises from research, experience, imagination. It's not an uninterrupted expository monologue or a seamless narrative or a collection of poems. It's composed of many genres and subgenres, each piece self-contained, so there's something about one individual genre itself that communicates something and makes its own point, yet it's connected by a theme or a topic or sometimes language, images, content, organization that pulls all the genres together. In addition to many genres, a multi-genre paper may also contain many voices, not just the authors. For more information and overview of ideas of multi-genre writing, this is another element of the Colorado State resource that you might find useful. Provide some introductions as well as some examples of multi-genre projects. Let's take a look. So here we have students who submitted, again, linguistic mode mostly, multi-genre pieces. What's interesting is you can see how they submitted it. These were individual pages submitted in a folder. So when we start to think about the practicalities of this, of creating it as well as teaching it, we want to consider some of those things. So here we have a letter. Here we have a rehabilitation center application for admission. Have you ever thought of submitting an application as evidence of a genre within a research piece? How might that fit in, if at all, with your inquiry project? Can you think of anything similar that might explain and help address your research questions and represent your data, your secondary sources? Personal statement. So here is obviously the title is Cocaine Addiction and Recovery, so we can see how these things might fit in. Journal entry. So the author of this piece had to create these, but they were speaking from a different person's point of view. A visual collage. Again, while this is visual, we're still primarily in the linguistic mode. And this is a letter of completion of the rehabilitation program and the work cited for this piece. I encourage you to look through all these different possible multi-genre projects to see what you think of them, what comes to mind as you look through them. So let's think about it for a little bit. What are you thinking about multi-genre in relation to multimodality? Where do the two meet? Where do they diverge? How, if at all, do you see these ideas of multimodality and multi-genre fitting into your writing or your teaching, if that's applicable for you? Take a minute to pause and work through some of these ideas. Welcome back. So now we need to think about some more practicalities of these ideas of multi-genre and multimodality. And how do we assess these things? How do we know that any thinking, any skills have been learned when we look at these projects and these compositions that at first might seem not what school is supposed to do or not the type of writing that's expected in a professional setting? So we're going to get a little crazy here to help us think about assessment. And we're actually going to read a multimodal article published in Cairo. Some of you have had Dr. Buckner, may have heard of this publication already. Once you click on that link, you'll need to click Launch Article. The reason this might be blowing your mind right now is we are engaging in a multimodal reading act, even though this is an article. So here are the sections of this article, and when you click on them, we are taken into the article. All of these, the image, the layout, was all designed by the author. So here's some quotes that help us think about this. If we agree that computers can challenge and this change not only pedagogies but also writing and reading processes, then it follows that these changes necessitate a transition from assessment practices based in theories about print literacy to assessment practices based in computer-assisted composition theory. And so what that means is it may not make sense to do complete matching of here's what I would expect if a student were writing a traditional black words on the white page essay, and so I need to look for those same things in a piece like the one we're looking at now. That doesn't exactly make sense. So we might have to rethink what our expectations are when we are asking someone or asking ourselves to engage in a multimodal, multi-genre project. We attribute the gap between the quality of our online assignments and our ability to assess them largely to the mismatch between our assessment criteria and digital environments. So again, that idea of we have to rethink what literacy means given how people communicate. Then we also have to think differently about how we assess if we are asking our students to communicate their ideas differently. So here's the author's words. And one of her main arguments is, my own suggestion is this web text involves another adaptation of familiar practices to the new situation of student new media production. Rather than assessing individual modes in a multimodal work, I suggest an assessment strategy that focuses on the effectiveness with which modes such as image, text, and sound are brought together or literally composed. I propose that we draw on our familiarity with rhetorical tropes, and specifically that of metaphor and metonymy, to provide us with a language with which to talk to our students about the effectiveness of their work. So what are the realities of this? We can think of, first, starting with what we know, the criteria and expectations that we like to think of having or that our students would have. We can start from there. So a lot of us are realizing the value of process work. Can we have process work in multimodal, multi-genre writing and compositions? Absolutely. So might that be something that would want to be acknowledged in an assessment piece for multimodal, multi-genre work? Rhetorical knowledge. Do we consider ideas of audience, purpose, the format, the medium, the modality used? Think back to those websites. Think back to that example that we just looked at from Colorado State. Were those taken into consideration, the rhetorical elements? Absolutely. Conventions is an interesting one because when someone's creating something like a visual collage that we looked at in that one student example from Colorado State, we are not looking per se for grammatical correctness. spelling correctness and something like that. But there is a convention, a style to collage. So what is that? Well, then we get into things like arrangement. Collages are not meant to be linear. They're not meant to be in traditional read left to right, top to bottom form. So did the student acknowledge that and recognize that and create an appropriate to that genre, collage, convention style? Did they follow it? So those would be some of the things that you'd have to consider when assessing a piece like this. There also will be many new criteria and expectations that need to be considered. The choices of color, font, not only the style of font, but the size of the font, the media and the medium, so how is the message delivered, how are the genres put together, what encapsulates them and creates the whole text, the position, the shapes, the order, composer's intent, and this is a big thing for me that I've learned is that when I'm creating and asking students to engage in multi-genre, multimodal, a reflection is a must. And it's a more than just how did they feel about the piece or what were things that we did in class that helped them or what questions do they want me to address in my response. This reflection becomes an explanation, a defense even of the choices that were made. Here's what I was trying to do. Here's why I chose this color. Here's why I put it in this order, whatever it is that they put together multimodally. And then we can actually get an audience reaction, and so that can be a component of assessment for these pieces. We can post these, we can share these, they can be presented in different ways than a blackboards on a white page paragraph with citations paper. We wouldn't typically ask a student to read that in class. So let's look at an example of this from one of my students. So again, as we've talked about and I've shown you before, I asked students to write a reflection of how they assess themselves. However, with this piece, I also asked students to explain the choices that they made with their piece. Process work, as always, so you'll see elements from their daybook, an explanation of what those are. And it's difficult to show process when you're working digitally. So we decided as a class, because I had not worked through this before, we decided as a class that screenshots could be a way to capture the process. This student was able to do it just by taking a picture of her screen of her initial draft. And then she's got some comment here on how she felt about that initial draft. More process work. A new draft. Another draft, and then discussion of the current draft. This is an infographic, which means literally what it says, information in graphic form, and this is done on a website called smore.com. See, as I just walk through, if you can get a sense of some rhetorical elements, audience, purpose, and some choices that the student made to present her ideas about this topic. So as you're looking through, what do you feel like the student's trying to convey? What are the choices in how, what modalities are made to convey that? The medium is Smore, the website, the infographic form. Are there any decisions about font being made, color, order, and the effectiveness, the affordances of those? So let's take some time now and get back to our daybook and do some what are you thinking now writing. To consider as you're writing is this idea that I thought about when I was working through this workshop. If we live in a multimodal, multi-genre world, but are still valuing and requiring traditional black words on a white page, linear writing, in schools, is this okay? What are we telling young writers about literacy practices that are expected in school versus those that might be expected of them in the real world or in a workplace? Take a minute and justify both. I think we can play the believing game for both And think about, is there space for both to coexist? Do we have to have a polarity? It's one or the other. Do we have to be on a side? Can we envision a world where all is incorporated? And anything else that might come to mind. Take some time now in your daybook. And then come back to work on part 3, which will be the practical, let's have some playtime and practice some of these multimodal, multi-genre ideas.